addition to taking hundreds of lives, the outbreak of novel coronavirus in China has also cast a shadow over economic growth prospects. With the World Health Organization declaring a global public health emergency, people have begun to consider its effects on the global economy. So what impact has the outbreak had so far on the Chinese economy? What efforts can help minimize the effect? And how will events in the world's second largest economy play out globally? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Einar Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, Jim Rogers, international investor and author of A Warning to Japan, and Hong Hao, chief strategist of the Bank of Communications International. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi. Mr. Tangen, let me start with you here. For the time being, the top priority for the Chinese government is still to prevent the spread of the virus, treat the patients and prevent more people from catching the virus, but it has to anticipate the level of impact this epidemic would have on the Chinese economy. What goes into their decision making? And in your opinion, how do you evaluate the impact of the epidemic, both short-term and long-term?
Well, in the short term, China is being very aggressive also on the economic end. They've injected a tremendous amount of cash over the weekend, and they're doing what is necessary to ensure liquidity. The danger for most Chinese companies, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, not the SOEs, they can take care of themselves, but a lot of them have very small margins, and there's going to be a cash crunch. They need immediate relief. I don't think that this is going to be as big an issue as a lot of people are showing. The markets are showing a lot of panic. I think it's probably wrong. What you have here is the government is acting very aggressively to curtail this particular virus, and in so doing, they're going to shorten it. Remember, SARS was 6 months. Hopefully, this will only be 3. That means 1 quarter, and you can anticipate that there will be a lot of catch-up through the rest of the year. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the Chinese economy, but they have to act quickly to make sure that these companies don't go under during the meantime. They still have wage commitments. They still have to pay their utilities. They still have to pay their rent. So it's important to make sure that they don't get knocked down in this process.
Mr. Rogers, let me bring you into this discussion. Mr. Tangen is, of course, watching this situation unfold here from inside China. As someone keeping a close tab on the situation from outside China, do you share that evaluation? What's your take on the economic impact here?
Well, the Chinese government is and has to cut their losses as quickly as possible. They've got to get rid of this epidemic, or it's going to get much, much worse. So they're doing the right thing, it seems to me, from outside, of trying to close it down. The sooner they close it down, the better. But in the meantime, there are going to be people who are going to companies that are going to suffer because they're dead in China now. They're leveraged companies in China now. And some of them may go to the wall if this lasts very much longer.
Mr. Hong, at a press conference earlier today, we heard from a top NDRC official, that's the National Economic Planner, that whatever impact this would have on the Chinese economy, it would be temporary, and that the long-term economic prospect and growth looks pretty much intact. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that, in the sense that, for many of the forecast scenarios that I've seen, many of them have the peak of the epidemic within the month of February. So if that's true, then I would say that, the impact on the economy is fleeting. But, that being said, I would say that, the first quarter for the Chinese economy is going to be very tough.
People, of course, like to compare this to the SARS epidemic back in 2003, and they gauge the economic impact this time based on how the economy fared 17 years ago. Mr. Tangen, does that make sense to you? Because after all, conditions are very different today. China is a much bigger economy. We're growing at a slower pace, of course, around 6%. Back in 2003, it was around 10%. But the per capita GDP we have today is more than $10,000. Back then it was somewhere around just $1,000. Given those differences, would you say the Chinese economy is more resilient today, given its size and given the Chinese government's experience in dealing with epidemics?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, for a number of reasons. First off, in 2002, just before SARS, China grew at 9%. In 2003, during the epidemic, it was 10%. In the following year, it was getting near 11%. So it might have had an effect, but it didn't have this kind of downward negative pressure. Now, fast forward to today, what do you have? A situation where China is now 4 times the size it was in 2003, and they have an outsized proportion of effect on the world economy. But given what we've said, if they can keep this to 3 months or less than 6 months, and there is this kind of rapid move towards catching up in the last part, I think it'll be okay. I would agree with Mr. Rogers that the real issue here is not losing people in the meantime. But I would add one thing. This is a kind of sweet and sour situation. There was a quote by a U.S. official who said that this would be good for America because jobs would leave China. I think if people start really thinking about this and see how China has reacted swiftly, they're going to set the gold standard for dealing with a pandemic. And it's going to be very, very difficult for any country to follow that. So if you're thinking about other countries, India, Indonesia, other places where they don't have the kind of medical infrastructure that's necessary, they don't have the kind of governmental controls, I assure you this would be a much, much larger issue if and when that happens.
And Mr. Rogers, I believe it was the U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross who made remarks about how the epidemic in China is an opportunity for the United States, potentially expediting jobs moving back to North America. Your take on those remarks?
Well, I was a little startled to hear Wilbur say that. I don't see any, maybe 2 jobs or 6 jobs, but I don't see that this is going to cause anybody to leave China and go back to America or anywhere else. China is going to do something about the epidemic. Other countries have epidemics. You know, last year in America, 80,000 people died of the flu. Does that mean companies are going to leave America because 80,000 Americans died of the flu in 1 year? And every year, that happens every year. So I was startled and surprised, and I ignore it. And as far as SARS, I don't pay too much attention. You have to look at everything, of course, but SARS was years ago. China was a different country. China didn't have debt then. Lots of things are different now. We have much more important things to look at than SARS.
Mr. Rogers, if this were to have any effect on regions outside of China, what type of effect would it be? Ripple effect in the global economy? Would that be an exaggeration?
No, of course it's going to. Look at Asia. It's affecting Asia. You go to an airport now. You get on a plane now. You go to a hotel. I'm in Korea at the moment. I just left Singapore. No, it's having an effect in many countries in Asia, rightly or wrongly. I get emails from people in China saying that they don't go out now because they're afraid to go out. The same is happening in other Asian countries. I don't think they'd have to worry, but it's happening. And when people don't go out, somebody suffers.
Mr. Hong, because people are not going out for the duration of the Spring Festival, I want to have you look at what sectors and industries are suffering the most here. People are not going out because of extensive travel restrictions put in place to curb the spread of the virus, and some also because they simply fear the virus. And as a result, sectors like tourism, food and catering, entertainment, logistics, transport are likely to take a hit. How bad is the situation?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the industries that you mentioned are the hardest hit. Basically, if you look at the movie industry, for example, this year the movie box office intake is down 99.9%. So basically, nobody is going to the cinema to see the movie. So that's the situation right now. I think the restaurant industry is also very hard hit as well. I think the industry take-in for this Lunar New Year is more than 50% off relative to last year. and also tourism industry, because of the travel restriction and also because of the general fear of contacting the virus. So people prefer to stay indoors. So, now if you go to Shanghai, Beijing, or many other Chinese cities that is in a lockdown mode, you will see very few people on the street. So I think, transportation, entertainment, restaurant, leisure, all these industries are being hit the hardest this time of the year.
These service sectors are taking a hit now, but in your estimate, Mr. Hong, when the epidemic peaks within the month of February, are we likely to see these sectors recover fast because of all the pent-up demand there?
Well, I would hope so, but I think the fact is that, there would be lingering fear in people's mind, regarding the virus, and also, people could be afraid that, by going out too early, they could still contact the virus. So I would say that, for the sake of containing the virus and also for the sake of general health, even if we were successful controlling the virus within the month of February, it is still not advisable for people to go out too soon.
Einar, your take on just how bad is the situation, on how big of an impact that this epidemic would have on these traditional service industries and sectors?
Well, you have to think of it in different ways. You have to be very creative when you're going at this. If you're a movie theater and you're not having, obviously no one's coming into your theaters, you have to think of some other things that you can do. And that means over the internet. Right now, even as we speak, people are literally putting the internet on its ear because there's so much online gaming, online ordering, chat going back and forth as people cannot physically see each other. They are exchanging messages and really overloading it. So this is an opportunity. Those who are smart will figure out ways in which they can deliver their goods and services to people at home so that they don't have to go out. So there's always a silver lining to these things. When there's confusion in the streets, there's money to be made. And hopefully, this will bring about a small silver lining in this otherwise very dark cloud.
Mr. Tengen, you mentioned how small and medium-sized enterprises are particularly at risk. Here, they're more susceptible to economic risks, and they need help from the government. In the example of the government of Suzhou in East China's Jiangsu province, the government is already offering policy support. They're taking down the tax burden for these smaller-sized firms. What do small and medium-sized enterprises need the most at the moment, and what type of policy support should the government be offering them?
Well, I mean, if I was the government, I would be offering no-cost loans until this comes to an end, simply because they have, as I said, wages, utilities, rent that has to be paid. And where is the money coming from if they're not getting it from the goods? So remember, so many of China's companies, the reason that they do so well internationally is because their margins are incredibly low. It's a very competitive field. So in order to make sure that you don't lose a lot of the muscle, the economic muscle of China, remember these are the ones that create 90% of the new jobs, you want to make sure that they can survive this period and then give them some leeway so they can pay this money back, hopefully within the year. I wouldn't extend these loans out more than 1 year. That would be an appropriate time for them to do it. There'd have to be some due diligence made so that this system is not gamed. But that's the kind of thing that you need. Cut the taxes, give very low-cost no-cost loans, and let them kind of sit it out.
Mr. Hong, your take on this? Mr. Tengen said SOEs will be relatively okay through the storm. It is those smaller firms that might have a problem here. If production and operation for them halt, a lot of them don't have the cash flow to carry them through this storm. On a policy level, what do they need here?
Yeah, I think the SMEs could run into a cash flow problem. They could encounter working capital shortage on a day-to-day level. But even before this epidemic, one should see that the SMEs in China is actually getting very difficult to get credits from banks. So even before this crisis, the PBOC was using targeted policies to help them out. but to a very limited extent of success. So I think going into the epidemic, the virus spread, I think the SMEs could need more help. And I think for now the policy tends to be lowering the repo rates, injecting short-term liquidities, and just now there's an announcement of 300 billion MLF being rolled out, etc., etc. But I think in general, these measures is only increasing the overall liquidity in the Chinese system. But I think we need more targeted measure specifically for the SMEs.
Mr. Rogers, let's talk about the stock market here in China. On the first trading day after the Spring Festival holiday, stocks plummeted here on the Chinese mainland market. For nervous investors, how do you explain what is going on here? Does this create an opportunity to buy in?
Well, there's a wonderful word in Mandarin, which we do not have in English. We haven't been around as long as you. Wei ji, and I'm sure I pronounced it wrong, but Wei ji means opportunity and disaster go hand in hand. They're the same thing. So normally, in any market, when there's a disaster, a typhoon or something like that, it's an opportunity to buy things. I didn't buy anything today, partly because I'm lazy, but partly because I just want to watch for a while. But normally, people who buy shares at times like this do well over the next year or two. Remember Wei Ji.
Mr. Hong, can I ask if you bought anything today? Your take on the stock market performance?
I think today's market had one of the worst experience in decades. It's a very ugly day out here in the Chinese market. But then at the same time, I think the market is having a one-off event to mark the market price towards the new reality. I think during the Chinese New Year, the other market had the opportunity to reflect the virus spread. But I think the Chinese market is closed. So I think today is sort of a Marktomarket event happening here. I think going forward, given that today's prices has already reflected much of the fundamental change in the Chinese economy, I think going forward, with policy support and also with other measures, hopefully we could see some improvement in the Chinese market.
Mr. Hong, do you see the Chinese government scramble to stabilize the market with more policies on the way? How do they help maintain investor confidence at a time like this?
Yeah, I think even though today's market movement has been very dramatic, but keep in mind that it's a mark-to-market event. So basically, today is the first day in the last couple of weeks that the Chinese market had the chance to reflect the new reality. So one shouldn't be too surprised to see today's move. Now going forward, given that today's move is more fundamentally driven, I think going forward, unless the market has some panic selling, due to, for example, forced closure of some of the leverage positions out there, then I don't think the government should be too worried to step in to support the market. I think it should allow time for the market to work out by itself.
I want to build on the concept of Weiji mentioned by Mr. Rogers, which roughly translates into crisis and opportunities. Mr. Tangen, a lot of sectors are suffering, no doubt, but could there still be industries and sectors that will get a boost from all of this? You mentioned, of course, people are spending a lot of time doing things online. Online entertainment, education, live streaming are likely to get a boost from this. Is that your opinion? What about health and medicine when this crisis dies down?
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting opportunities. Everything you said is absolutely correct, but medicine is going to be a very, very interesting one because, over the last few years, you've had a lot of online diagnosis where you literally, instead of going in the doctor's office, you have a way to, in essence, do the pre-screening, which cuts down a lot of time and resources. And I think there's going to be a move more towards this. After all, if I'm if I think I'm sick, the last place I want to go is to a hospital where I know there are a lot of sick people there. But I'm forced to because I have to see what I have. So I think there's going to be a lot more attention to pay. I think it's going to be something where the consumers say, this is something I want. It's absolutely more convenient than getting up and going somewhere when you're not feeling well, when you have questions and things like that. So that's definitely an area to do. Also education, anything online. Once again, China has the logistics and the payment platforms, Alibaba and Tencent, that allows them to do this kind of online shopping and to deliver anything basically people want. And I think you're going to see a large boom in that. The only restriction, of course, is making sure that there's somebody to deliver it.
If the time period after the SARS epidemic in 2003 was any indication, it is that business opportunities do rise for people and for people with a keen eye on the situation. Jack Ma pretty much came up with Taobao in the aftermath of the SARS epidemic in 2003, and look where that got him. Mr. Rogers, your take on potential sectors and industries rising from this crisis?
Well, first of all, I just want to go back. I hope the government stays out of the stock market. Normally, governments think they have to do something, and they often do the wrong thing. So let the market work it out by itself without the government, and they will want, maybe some people will suffer temporarily, but don't worry too much. But obviously, yes, anybody who can do something online is going to benefit from all of this. I'm not the only person who realizes that people aren't going out. They have to do something, and they're going to do it from home. I mean, I hope I'm sure Jack Ma is sitting there figuring out what to do right now, but he's not the only one. Right now, there are a lot of 18-year-olds in garages figuring out what to do.
Mr. Hung, your take on the situation, 18-year-olds thinking of what to do in the garages?
Yeah, well, I think the internet industry has developed tremendously in the past decade. I think going forward, you know, the virus spread, you know, sort of ring the alarm bell in people's mind regarding how best to approach biotechnology research and also the general health care in the Chinese population. It is still lacking. You know, for example, patients in parts of Wuhan still lack access to, you know, proper health care. So during this epidemic, so I would say that, you know, going forward, besides the opportunity that is being offered by the internet industry, healthcare industry and other related biotech research industry will benefit as well.
As the Chinese government endeavors to put a stop to the spread of the virus, it is understandable that other regions and areas in the world are nervous about what's happening in China. Although the chief of the WHO said the organization is not in favor of travel or trade restrictions being imposed on China, countries like the United States and Australia have issued a travel alert and some in the form of a travel ban on China. Mr. Tangen, what will these actions, these measures do to people-to-people exchanges, to trade, to the free flow of personnel?
Well, let's put this in perspective. There was no need to do this. The WHO was pretty clear that China needed to take aggressive actions and was, but it wasn't necessary elsewhere. They said that you just set up monitoring areas and make sure that you know as much as possible. If anybody has, you know, you talk to them. You say if anybody's been in contact with somebody who has been sick, or in particular areas that are hotspots, which can be identified with the models that they have. I think one of the universities, Johns Hopkins, has put together a CDC, WHO, Chinese CDC map showing where it is. You just tell people if you've been there, you do that. That's what they did with swine fever, which was much more severe in terms of its potential lethality. We're talking almost, it was 36, 38% mortality rate. And they didn't, you know, set off alarms and say no one can come here. They just asked you if you've been to a farm, if you've been to a certain country. If you had, please, you know, stay at home and make sure that you're not going to allow somebody else to get this and seek medical treatment if you have these kind of symptoms. So this is overreaction. It brings into this question something very ugly about this, and that is the U.S. using this as another card, another 360-degree point of pressure on China? in essence, to forestall its rise. And I think it's pretty clear that, especially in relation to the other moves, this thing with Tibet and things like that, that they are veering towards this, that they see this as an opportunity to demonize China, as we've seen a lot in the international press. And I'm not saying that China doesn't have its problems. The issue is, why is it all of a sudden that everything that China does, including its its lauded reaction to this virus, somehow now horrible, terrible, evil empire type stuff?
And Mr. Rogers, we heard your take and your advice on the Chinese government staying out of the stock market. Can I hear your take on what the foreign governments, nervous foreign governments, should I add, on what they can do to both realize the protection of their citizens and maybe not inhibiting the free flow of goods and services and people that are so crucial to the health of the world economy?
Well, unfortunately, politicians and bureaucrats love something like this because they get to do something, and they tell everybody they're solving the problem. They're usually making the problem worse. I said to you before, tens of thousands of Americans die every year from the flu. Are we going to close down America? No, of course we shouldn't close down Australia or America or anywhere else. But politicians love it. Whether it's diabolical or not, I don't know. But the media loves it too. You sell more newspapers, more people watch your TV shows. Is that good or bad? You make it worse, perhaps, with all of your hysteria. I mean, not you, of course, not CGTN, but other people.
I hear you. Mr. Hong, we don't have a lot of time left. Briefly, if you can, your take on governments from the world over their measures in keeping their people safe and at the same time allowing the free flow of goods, services, and people?
Yeah, well, given the current knowledge about the virus, I think the governments around the world is overdoing it. The global trade index is sinking into negative territory. So I think any measure to help promote global trade would be beneficiary to the global economy.
All right, I want to thank all three of my guests for your expertise and your insight today. We'll all keep watching how the economy will fare after this is over. Thank you so much for joining me. And this is Dialogue. I'm Zhong Shi. Thank you for your company. Goodbye.